Sup guys? In this video I'm going to be going over the data mine of the content from the new event Snowrealm Peregrination. I wonder where they find these words. Like, maybe I'm just an uneducated fool, but it feels like I'm reading a different language sometimes with these event titles. Anyway, as always, the data mine will be linked in the description, and I'll be mostly giving you my thoughts on the ships rather than reading every single stat and skill out loud. Okay, let's begin with the star of the show, Sovetskaya Soyuz. She's got great stats as expected of an ultra rare, but nothing too exceptional in that aspect. Her skills on the other hand are quite exceptional. Let's begin with her barrage. It activates when her main gun finishes loading and not when it fires. It instantly spawns a glacier that is divided into 7 different parts on the highest priority enemy, so I don't think it could possibly miss. Here's what it looks like in game. In terms of the hitbox, there's a 35 unit radius circle in the middle, then 6 30 radius circles around it, meaning that they should overlap and all hit the same target at once. While it's not the strongest barrage damage-wise, it can't miss the way New Jersey's or Bismarck's even salvable barrage can. Also, it doesn't have the weakness of fixed location effects like Bismarck's black hole or Monarch's barrage, which depending on the boss's movement pattern can completely whiff. There are times where the boss just hugs the top or bottom side of the screen and Bismarck's black hole can't reach them, and Soyuz's barrage will never be affected by that. The damage of the barrage on paper is around the level of New Jersey's, which is weaker than Bismarck and Musashi's, and also keep in mind that New Jersey gets an extra proc 10 seconds into the fight as well, but the fact that it's impossible to miss should make up for some of that difference. Enemies hit by the barrage are debuffed with a 40% slow, damage taken plus 8% debuff, and Soyuz herself gains 10% crit rate against them as well. As it goes off instantly before she fires, she's guaranteed to always have these effects apply to the enemy when her shelling hits them. Her reload also isn't the highest, so with the way it works, it will allow her to debuff for ships that fire just before her as well in a lot of cases. Before moving on to her second skill, she's already an improved and 100% consistent version of Monarch, which in itself is already worthy of being a UR. Now, let's take a look at the second skill. First, she has a faction buff which buffs all the major damage stats by 15%. It kinda looks similar to Bismarck's Way's buffs, except Bismarck's Way buffs AA instead of Torpedo, so it's actually a direct upgrade. Now I'm wondering why the Northern Parliament happens to have the best modern faction buffer, and well before the other major factions as well, aside from Ironblood. Anyways, her buffs don't just stop there. If you sortie her along with 2 carriers, she gives the entire main fleet 10% accuracy and the carriers 10% damage. Currently, there are only 2 carriers who can double dip into both the faction buff and the carrier buff, but totaling up the 15% aviation, 10% accuracy, and damage, you're looking at an almost 30% damage increase to Northern Parliament carriers, which is near the level of Nagato's carrier buffs, and once you factor in the debuffs from her first skill, goes even beyond the level of Nagato. Even for non-Northern Parliament carriers, she's giving a 40% slow and about a 20% damage increase. Consider for example a main fleet of Musashi, Shinano, and Haku. Soyuz almost certainly deals less damage than Musashi against heavy, and potentially against medium as well, but with the added bonus of her carrier buffs and slow, I wouldn't be surprised if Soyuz is found to be a better option than Musashi. Another pretty commonly used fleet archetype is using Bismarck's Way to set up carriers with her black hole, as well as receive Plymouth's buff. In fights with multiple enemies, the black hole is irreplaceable, but if you're only up against a single enemy, it's highly probable that replacing Bismarck with Soyuz would lead to better results, as Soyuz's 20% carrier buffs should outweigh the extra damage Bismarck has over her, and while the slow is in some ways a weaker effect than the black hole, it is 100% consistent and lasts longer, making it easier to sync with. Consider using Soyuz with 2 of Implacable, Haku, Shinano, or Chkalov. There probably aren't many fleets you could come up with that would be a direct upgrade in terms of raw power over that against medium or heavy armor. I hope that I've made the case for her as a carrier buffer, and ironically, she plays better with carriers in general than the likes of Yorktown 2 and New Jersey, who you would assume would be more carrier supportive, being in the faction with the most amount of carriers and all. But it doesn't just stop there. If there are at least 2 battleships in the fleet, she dishes the carrier buffs for self buffs instead, so she can just as easily slot into a battleship fleet. Totaling up just her self buffs, she has 15% firepower, 10% bonus damage, 8% bonus damage from debuffs, which is multiplicative with the 10%, 20% crit rate, and a 10% reload. Looking at the data mine, it seems like the crit rate is not specific to her gun damage, which is the case for many other crit buffs in the game, so all these buffs apply to her barrage as well. All these buffs in totality are stronger than the buffs of pretty much all of the other Rainbow battleships, and should more than make up for her weaker barrage damage. So, not only does she offer buffs to the entire fleet with her debuffs, but her personal damage is no slouch either. Between the 2 versions of the buff, she can find herself a spot in literally any type of fleet composition. But I expect her to be closer to a Bismarck's Way in a battleship fleet than say Vanguard or New Jersey. She also has a 3rd skill, but it's barely a skill, as it's mostly torpedo damage reduction, which won't be in play in anything other than PvP, but the first 2 skills are easily enough to make her one of the best ships in the game. Once again, the thing that really sets her apart from her competition is really just how flexible she is. And for those who are worried about power creep or whatever, just keep in mind that the difference is not really that big, and probably won't be a deal breaker in whether or not you can win a battle. The more options we have, the more you're allowed to choose based on aesthetics rather than performance, which at least for me is a good thing. Compared to when New Jersey first came out and she was used for everything, now you can more or less avoid using any ship that you don't like without much repercussion. One last tip for Soyuz before we move on. Once you get her, you need to put this iceball gear skin on her for the purpose of optimization. The secondary is optional, but the main gun skin is not. Okay, so that was a pretty long segment for Soyuz alone. Fortunately, I'll be able to get through the rest of the ships relatively quickly. Let's move on to Annavoy. First of all, she has no defensive skills aside from her tiny heal, so she's quite squishy. In content where you actually need her little bit of healing, you'll have to put her in the middle of the Vanguard, where San Francisco would likely heal twice as much as her, as most mob battles last around 50 seconds, and oftentimes less. Jervis also heals as much as she does in 50 seconds, but only 20 seconds in, and Jervis can tank as well. For her to be useful, she would have to pull her weight in terms of damage. She has a ton of firepower buffs, but only 1 main gun mount and pretty weak torps. Her timed barrage is quite decent, but it's not a guaranteed proc, and usually main fleet ships get last hits in campaign, so I don't expect it to double proc often. Overall, I would eyeball her to have similar damage to the likes of Felix on auto, but without any of the survivability. I'm open to being surprised in the future with some further testing though, but for now I'm not impressed. Moving on, both the purples are quite weak, so I'm just going to skip over them. The last ship of the new batch is Pamiat Meta. She's got the same evasion skill as the regular Pamiat. While it doesn't say here, the regular version of it starts on cooldown, and I think this one should too, which makes it a lot weaker than it seems. She's a bit tanky, but the variance is quite high, which makes her unreliable as a tank, just like the regular version. She has an AoE slow effect, but 20% is a bit slow, so I wouldn't put too much stock into it. If you want a Vanguard with a weak slow, you're probably better off using Kirov Meta instead. Her barrages are stronger than the ones from her base version, but not so strong that it makes her a DPS monster. In total, she's just a slightly upgraded version of Pamiat Retrofit, but since she can't receive all the Northern Parliament buffs going around, she might just end up being about the same. Now, let's take a look at the new equipment. The battleship gun is actually very strong. There's no need to look at its DPS. All we need to look at are the damage per salvo, cooldown, and spread. The cooldown puts it around the tier of Champagne Gun and Marco Polo Gun. It has exceptionally high base damage, and mods skewed specifically toward medium armor. In fact, out of the guns I previously mentioned, this one deals the most on a per salvo basis against medium, meaning that for the same number of shots, it'll be the strongest gun. It also has 17 spread, meaning that it doesn't need further spread reduction to be consistent enough against stationary enemies. While it is a little bit slower than the other two guns, this means that you could also just put it on Vanguard and have an easier time syncing with other battleships. But you could also just use it on your strongest battleship instead for the raw damage if timing is of no concern. Overall, it's a lower priority to invest in than Champagne Gun because of its longer cooldown and lower damage against heavy, but I'd say it's overall stronger than the Marco Polo gun for specifically medium armor enemies, and definitely a gun that will see plenty of use going forward. The final thing to go over is this auxiliary equipment. All you need to ask yourself is, would the ship sink if I replace another defensive auxiliary with this one? If not, and your flagship is a battleship, then there is little reason not to use it. Okay, that should be it for this update. Hope you found it informative. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.